Hello and welcome to Socialism, the weekly Marxist analysis podcast from the Socialist Party. Recent events in Venezuela, with an attempted pro-imperialist right-wing coup, have reignited discussion and debate on what type of regime exists there. Defenders of capitalism say that the social catastrophe in Venezuela proves that socialism doesn't work. But in today's episode, we outline that in reality it only proves that attempting reforms without taking the step of fundamentally transforming society along socialist lines doesn't work. If you agree, get in touch to find out more about joining the Socialist Party by visiting socialistparty.org.uk/join. Now, over to Sarah Rack.
I'm here today with Tony Saunois, who is the Secretary of the CWI, the international organisation that the Socialist Party is part of. Hi, Tony.
Hi.
And today we're going to be talking about recent events in Venezuela, which have been in the press a lot here. So to start with, Tony, why is what's happening in Venezuela at the moment relevant for us here in Britain? Why do we care about it?
Well, I think there's two main reasons. One is, of course, because as socialists and internationalists, we'd be extremely concerned about any development internationally and the effect that it's having on the working people of Venezuela and indeed, in this case, the working people of the whole of Latin America. But on the other side, there is a further dimension to the developments as to why it is particularly important for the position here in Britain. And that is because we see in the reaction of the right wing in Venezuela, the reaction of Trump in the United States, and the whole of the EU ruling classes, how they've reacted to try and overthrow the Maduro and the Chavez regime. And that has important lessons and important implications as to how the ruling class would react to the coming to power of a Corbyn-led government if it attempted to carry through a serious policy of radical reform in the interests of working people here in Britain. So there's very many lessons that we have to draw from the developments in Venezuela, because they will have a direct bearing on the future of Britain should Jeremy Corbyn succeed in forming a new radical left Labour government in the future.
Absolutely, and we should come back to those lessons a bit later. But to start with, I suppose, can you just give us an overview, really, of what has happened in the last couple of weeks in Venezuela?
Well, I think what we've seen in Venezuela in the last couple of weeks has been yet a further attempt, and it's probably the third or fourth attempt by the right wing inside Venezuela, representing the interests of the oligarchs and the ruling class, together with the representatives of international capitalism, have launched a new offensive to try and overthrow the Maduro government. You've seen the intervention of Juan Guaido, the president of the National Assembly, who was previously a relatively unknown figure, or not a particularly significant or important figure in Venezuela, has now declared himself the self-appointed president of Venezuela. And of course, he's been recognised immediately by Donald Trump and by other representatives of European capitalism. And absolutely scandalously, you've seen the complete capitulation by the so-called socialists in the Socialist parties in Spain, the Socialist Party of France, the Socialist Party of Portugal. All have sold their souls and fallen in behind Guaido and accepted his self-appointment as a new president. They've called mass demonstrations in support of the opposition. But at the same time, what we've seen is the mass demonstrations which have taken place in defence of the Maduro government. And that's something that's been expunged from the global press and media, where we've seen really a clear policy of fake news, where the pro-Maduro government demonstrations have just been marginalised and barely reported. And the biggest mistake, really, they've made is that the Maduro government has been able to mobilise mass support in the last few days, really, in response to the declaration of Donald Trump that military intervention was not off the agenda. And because of the role of US imperialism historically, where they've been responsible for the organising of a whole series of military dictatorships, of direct military intervention in El Salvador, Nicaragua, Chile, Argentina, the whole of Latin America, really. That has enraged the Venezuelan population, who are not satisfied with the Maduro government. It's true, but that does not mean to say they've been prepared to support the intervention of US imperialism militarily or in any other form. And we now had the prospect of a major conflict developing within inside Venezuela, where you couldn't exclude, as Maduro himself has warned, the situation being plunged into a civil war position. But we have to see how events unfold. But US imperialism, through its intervention, is not going to get it all its own way, and that's been reflected in the course of the last few days. In particular, you saw the strike that was called in the oil company, the state-owned oil company, by the trade unions there, and a mass demonstration of the oil workers in response to Trump's threat to impose sanctions to freeze the funds of the oil company in Venezuela. And that was followed on Saturday by the convening of mass demonstrations throughout the country in support of the Maduro government. It's true the right-wing opposition also had very large demonstrations, but there's a major division now has opened up, and we'll see how that conflict plays out in the course of the next period.
Okay, so to maybe go into a bit more detail about the two sides of that division then, starting with Maduro, how would you describe the Maduro regime? And I suppose a lot of people will be questioning what type of country is Venezuela now? Is it a socialist country?
That's the fundamental issue, really, that I think we had to address. Maduro came to power as president following the death of Hugo Chavez in 2013, and that represented an important point of departure. But to really characterize the Maduro regime now, we have to go back a little bit to what happened with the election of Hugo Chavez in 1999. And as the CWI pointed out at the time, his election represented a decisive change, because he was the first government to come to power internationally in that era, clearly with an agenda of opposition to the neoliberal policy. He didn't speak about socialism at that stage. He spoke about developing a Bolivarian revolution, of ending the discrimination between rich and poor which existed in the country, against corruption, and put quite a radical agenda forward. And that was immensely popular. But then in 2002, there was an attempted military coup by the far right to overthrow him. And that triggered a ferocious response as the workers and the poor flooded onto the streets in defence of Hugo Chavez. And the coup was defeated. And by the way, US imperialism was involved in that attempted coup as well. But that was defeated. And then following that, a whole revolutionary wave opened up in Venezuela. Chavez himself was pushed further to the left by this phenomenal pressure that developed from the Venezuelan workers. Factories were occupied. Chavez himself began to speak about socialism, and they embarked upon a very radical reform policy in health and education in particular. Some sectors of the economy were taken into public ownership. There was factory occupations which had taken place, and some elements of workers' control existed in some of the key sectors. And that was all very positive from the point of view of the Socialist Party, from the point of view of the CWI. But there was important deficiencies in that particular process, because despite the revolutionary waves, the attacks and incursions that were made against capitalism by the Chavez-led government, nevertheless it didn't move to conclusively overthrow capitalism and establish a genuine democratic socialist plan of production. And there was a big weakness in the whole movement. A lot of it, and it goes back to the weakness of the Venezuelan working class movement historically, a lot of it was carried down in quite an administrative, top-ended measures from top to bottom, where there wasn't the real elements of democratic workers' control, democratic workers' management, and a real check. And as a result of that, you had the emergence of a phenomenally strengthened bureaucratic caste, which because in the recent years has become extremely corrupt, have got their own vested interests. In fact, in Venezuela, they developed a term for it, where they dubbed it the Boliburguesia, the Bolivarian bourgeois, which is what developed, who were very well paid and very corrupt individuals within this particular process. Now, that situation has been compounded since the death of Chavez, since the coming to power of Maduro. The bureaucratic features, the repressive features have increased. We've also seen the consequences of economic sabotage by US imperialism. The sanctions have had a devastating effect. Of that there is no question at all. But it's been compounded by the fact the government didn't take measures to overthrow capitalism. It allowed the national capitalist class to conduct a policy of economic sabotage. Maduro, unfortunately, sought to try and reach an agreement, to secure a pact with the capitalist class. And now you've seen an economic catastrophe has developed, where the economy is plunged into a hyperinflationary nightmare, where they're expected or anticipating inflation can reach 10 million%, if anybody can imagine that, in the course of this year, according to the IMF. You have a collapse of all of the reform packages in health and education, which has taken place. An estimated 10% of the population have fled because of the spiraling social violence and economic collapse. We have a disastrous situation. And from that point of view, we would not defend the policies that have been introduced by the Maduro government. We're completely opposed to Trump's intervention. We're completely opposed to the right-wing attempted coup, which is what it is. Which is being carried through in the interests of capitalism. But at the same time, we can't have confidence or trust in the policies of the Maduro government. And the working class of Venezuela itself needs to move again onto the offensive to take power into its own hands and defeat capitalism and overthrow capitalism and establish a genuine form of socialism. What you have at the moment in Venezuela, they've used a bit of socialist rhetoric, but you have really more of a policy of a mixed economy, of a capitalist economy with strong elements of state intervention in it. But that's been also accompanied by the emergence of this massive bureaucracy. The military have been strengthened in it. They've been brought into the economic process, and you have a very corrupt regime, which we as socialists have to criticise and put forward an independent socialist position, but one which is based at this stage of opposing the attempts of imperialism to intervene, which would result in even greater catastrophe for the Venezuelan peoples if that intervention was successful.
And so I suppose obviously the opposition is taking advantage and gaining support, like you've said, on the basis of some of the failings that you've just outlined, on the bureaucratisation, the lack of democracy, the social catastrophe really that people are facing, the economic problems and so on. But what does that opposition really represent? You know, who are the opposition?
Well, that's a very important question. You see, one of the problems they've had, because they've had attempted movements against Maduro before in the last few years, but they've always collapsed. And one of the reasons is you've had big divisions in the opposition. You have a far-right paramilitary style layer of the opposition, another layer who are want to pursue what they would dub a more constitutional road and path, and that led to big divisions in them. But all of them, of the leaders, represent the interests of Venezuelan capitalism. All of them come from those who supported the coup in 2002, or who had supported an attack on the reform package of Chavez, and have defended the interests of the oligarchs and the rich. And should they come to power, they try to capitalise on the economic collapse, and they have succeeded in doing that, not just amongst the middle class, which has been their main base up to now. They've now have attracted, initially anyway, to the demonstrations, some sections of the working class who were so desperate because of the economic collapse, although that appears to have been reversed in the last few days, because people initially joined the demonstration because of their dissatisfaction with the Maduro government, but then with Trump's intervention, placing military intervention from the US on the agenda, that has terrified a lot, who said, well, we're not happy with the Maduro government, but that does not mean to say that we want the US military in control. We don't want to go into an Iraq-style situation of US imperialism coming in to seize the oil, of which, of course, Venezuela has vast amounts. So that's what you have in terms of the opposition. And they're just the representatives of the oligarchs, but they're demagogic. They're presenting themselves as the champions of democracy. These are the very people that tried a military coup in 2002 itself, have had a policy of economic sabotage from the very beginning of the Chavez regime. And should they come to power, representing the oligarchs and the Venezuelan ruling class, they will unleash a vicious campaign against socialists, against trade unionists, and against workers in general, because the leadership of this right wing, notwithstanding their rhetoric today, they will come, if they succeed in coming back to power, they will come back with a mentality of wanting revenge on the revolutionary movement and the movement which is encroached, and it has encroached, on some of the interests of capitalism, and they'll be out for revenge. And in some form, it will be a bloody revenge on some sections of the of trade unionists and workers, if they're successful. And it's far from certain that they are going to be successful at this stage. But we have to see it's going to be a struggle over the course of the next days and weeks, and we have to see how that develops.
So you've pointed out that the opposition is being backed by basically all the forces of international capitalism coming behind them. What do you think we can expect to see from Trump and the leaders of the European countries that have come out behind the opposition and so on as we go forward?
I think it's there's already a division. You see, Trump and his advisor Bolton have been had an agenda. They wanted to go into Venezuela to remove the Maduro government for a whole period. And they themselves would not discount a military or a partial military intervention. Well, it's a full-scale land intervention. We have to see. It might be more the deployment of paramilitary forces and squads to assist the right in Venezuela that will go in. That's their position, but they've been checked by other sections of the US ruling class and also by European capitalism. European capitalism now wants the Maduro regime out, but they're not happy because they've got more grasp of what the consequences of a military intervention will be, and they're not going to back that and will probably oppose it, or big sections of the European ruling classes would do. So you see a division has opened up in relation to that. Trump may be checked and may be held back, but they have a problem because they've broken the number one law, the first law. If you're going to organise a military coup, the first thing you need to ensure is that you've got the military on your side to carry it out. And at the moment, the military in Venezuela is staying with Maduro. And partly because they have their own vested interests militarily and economically. They've gained enormously as part of this new wing of the bourgeoisie, which the military form an important part of that. And the key question is, without the military, will they be able to overthrow the Maduro government? The question is, with the economic sanctions, it could just plunge the country into utter destitution, and you have an element of that now, which could see the erosion of the regime. However, having attempted this counter-revolution, with Trump wading in, even threatening the question of US intervention, because of the whole history of Latin America, that has enraged whole sections of the Venezuelan population, and looks like it has given the Maduro regime a new boost and basis of support that it could rest on for a whole period. And we shouldn't discount a peculiar position whereby, as a consequence of US imperialism's intervention, Maduro could be pushed in the course of this to take even more dramatic measures to strike out against capitalism and take further measures of expropriation against sections of the capitalist class. You couldn't rule that out now. But he's threatened, with justification, that if the Americans want to occupy and move in to Venezuela, they should expect a Vietnam type situation. And that would provoke a reaction, not just in Venezuela. Should Trump go down that lunatic path, it would provoke a ferocious reaction throughout the whole of Latin America because of the whole history of it. And we have to factor in there, and this is an important point with the Venezuelan military, we're talking here of Venezuela and and Colombia. This is the land of Simon Bolivar, who led the mass wars of independence against the Spanish, and that was the cardinal base. His base was in Venezuela, and the war that was conducted there runs right through the psychology of the masses. And that liberation movement, which was on a capitalist basis then, but nevertheless has etched into the consciousness of the masses. With everything that has happened since, an attempted military intervention is going to provoke a ferocious response if they do it. Probably Trump will be compared to hold back, although they will then go for a policy of sanctions and maybe backing up the right wing, supplying them with maybe death squads, and you could have an element of a civil war developing in Venezuela. But they have the problem: what happens with the military? Without the military, what can they do?
So the Socialist Party has a sister party in Venezuela, and obviously what you've outlined is that we are critical of the Maduro regime, but we're also completely opposed to these attempts to bring him down. So what are we putting forward about what needs to happen now?
Well, what our comrades in Venezuela are arguing, the comrades in the Izquierda Revolucionaria, what they're demanding is the mass mobilization of the Venezuelan working class for a revolutionary front to be formed of all the dissident rank-and-file Chavista movements of the trade unions, which should be mobilized in committees of defense, committees of action, for occupation of the factories, and a struggle should be unleashed to really drive the revolution forward in a more healthy socialist direction, to overthrow capitalism and establish a genuine system of workers' democracy and based on workers' control and democratic workers' management of the economy. And that has to be linked, because of the economic collapse, with an appeal to the rest of the workers of Latin America. And we have to say a big opportunity was lost in the revolutionary upheavals which took place in Venezuela after 2002, because it took place against the background of a revolutionary movement where reaction was defeated in Bolivia, the coming to power of a radical left government, Correa in Ecuador, and other developments in the continent. Has Chavez overthrown capitalism together with Bolivia, with Morales in Bolivia, with Correa in Ecuador, linking up with Cuba? They could have formed a voluntary socialist federation of those states, which could have begun the task of an appeal to and putting together an alternative beyond one country to appeal to the rest of the workers of Latin America and to the workers of North America as well. Now, that would have had a phenomenal international repercussion at the time, had they been prepared to take those measures. We should put it in its context. It was only a few years after those developments that you saw the revolutionary movement in Greece. Imagine if we'd have had a socialist federation of Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador and Cuba. If Greece had then joined in and been linked up, the basis for an appeal throughout Latin America and indeed to the countries of Spain and Portugal in the south of Europe, the road would have been open for that. But unfortunately, because they weren't prepared, the leaders were not prepared to complete that revolutionary process, that opportunity was lost, and now we have the re-emergence of this threat of counter-revolution in Venezuela, which of course has also come on the heels of the counter-revolution and the victory of Bolsonaro in Brazil as well.
So to finish where we started then, you mentioned that there are big lessons of this experience for Corbynism here, for Jeremy Corbyn and for those who are supporting him. What do you think those lessons are?
I think there's two lessons. One, unfortunately, because Jeremy and some of the other socialists on the left have adopted an uncritical attitude towards Maduro. And of course, we oppose the right-wing attempts of counter-revolution. But because they've been uncritical and they've just been cheerleaders, because of the methods that have been used by Maduro, which we wouldn't defend, unfortunately, they've allowed themselves to be exposed to attacks and criticism from Theresa May and from the capitalists. And they're going to use this in the forthcoming general election here. As they've used it in Spain, has been used as a club, as it was in Brazil as well, in the election campaign. Venezuela has been used as a club because of the social catastrophe which exists to beat the left. This is another example of the failure of socialism. It's not a failure of socialism. It's a failure of an attempt to introduce a reform capitalism and have a more humane form of capitalism. It's what has failed here. But the lessons will be, if Corbyn comes to power, attempts a radical program of reform, which we hope we would support the radical reforms, but they will be subject to a whole campaign and struggle of sabotage, of economic sabotage, and other measures that they would take to try and destabilise a government. And that is the fundamental lesson. If the Corbyn government coming to power wants to introduce lasting reforms in the interests of working people throughout Britain, then he's going to have to be prepared also to mobilise the working class, to stand up against the ruling class, the capitalist class in general, and to take the necessary measures to abolish capitalism by bringing to public ownership the major companies, the banks, and introducing a system of democratic workers' control, a democratically socialist planned economy. Because if he doesn't prepare to take those measures, he will fall victim to economic sabotage, to flights of capital, and other measures that they will introduce to destabilise the government and trigger an economic crisis through a run on the pound, etc., which will then be used to undermine a future Corbyn government. And that's the primary lesson we have to draw from these upheavals, which are shaking Venezuela to its foundation at the present time.
Okay, thanks very much for joining us, Tony.
You can read more on the current situation in Venezuela, but also our analysis of events under Chavez by checking out the episode notes at socialistparty.org.uk/podcast. Email us your thoughts or questions on anything Tony said, or suggestions for future episodes, to socialismpodcast@socialistparty.org.uk. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review and subscribe in your podcast app.